Hi, Monica.
Hey Fred, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. And you?
All's good, thank God.
So I'd meant to ask Joe what those little nightlight things were for. The ones with the logo on them.
Oh,
The
what
little
he
flat.
wanted the logo?
Yeah.
He's put one together for you.
Well, that's fine. Yeah, I just was curious about because I'd actually seen some of those on Amazon a while back, and thought they looked interesting. The little things they have. So I didn't know whether he had a project that he was, going to, go into the manufacturing process of doing a bunch of them or something.
No, not a bunch of them. He's been playing with a laser engraver.
Yeah, yeah. Is that one that he got, or is that using from like the Idea Foundry, or
Um, you know his friend Adlai Stein. This is a
not sure?
blacksmith.
Oh, that's where he's got his stuff out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
He rents studio space from Adlai.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Adlai bought a laser engraver for his for what
Ah,
he
well,
so
that makes sense. Yeah.
Joe and Adlai have been playing with it and learning how to use it.
Neat, neat. Yeah, I used it at school, and then I'd used it a little bit at the Idea Foundry. Not much there, but so yeah. Okay, neat. I'll have to get more information on him from him on what on just what it is and so on.
Well, he'll show you when he gets a chance.
Okay, thank you.
So did an email go out today, or there was no email that went out today?
Nothing came out.
Okay.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, I figured that's why you asked, but I haven't had time to even look for it since you asked me. Yeah. Okay.
I get so used to getting the reminder that when I didn't get one, I had to ask.
Yep, I understand. It's okay. It's a fun share, so it's unfortunate, but it's okay. We'll get it next time. Okay, so it's 8:31, so I'm going to get started, and if anyone else joins us, they'll join us shortly. So please unmute yourselves, and if you have any questions, feel free to unmute. So as a form of introduction, I will say that this year is not a shir that is halacha l'maaseh at all. It's not practical. It's much more of a musings on the topic. And the reality is that it's hard to one-to-one take the Jewish system of economics and try to superimpose it onto the modern system of economics. And it's really interesting to always try to kind of compare and contrast and find themes and try to highlight different takeaways as you highlight them over the course of time. How even within Torah circles you see certain movement, and how that may or may not reflect kind of parallels in the greater world. But what we're going to talk about tonight is the concept of taxes. Now, I didn't add it to this source sheet, but there's a Mishnah. I'm blanking on where the Gemara is that I looked at. I looked at a bunch of different Gemaras today. I think it was in one of the Babas, but I might be wrong, where it talks about how a person should not take money from the tax collector's box. And the explanation is because it might be considered stolen money. And the Gemara's response to that is, what do you mean stolen money? It's dina de malchuta dina. It's right. That's the law of the land. And I just thought that in general, that initial perspective on taxes in general is not, again, the instinct to call it stealing money, I think, is kind of the with a little bit of a wry smile how many of us sometimes feel at different moments, but at the end of the day, we understand and appreciate the importance of governments collecting monies from all of its constituents, that we're all in this together, and that hopefully government can be as efficient as possible at creating certain needs for the masses. But what I really want to talk about today is less about taxes from secular government and more about, if, let's say, we could create a world where there was truly a halachic system of economics that we were trying to build off of, what would that look like? And that's why I mean that this is not at all practical, and certainly if and when that should become a future possibility, I am certain that I will most likely not be a part of that conversation. So this is really just having some fun on the topic. So to start us off, just so we know what we're talking about, this is just a helpful, concise translation of what a tax is, because the truth is that we'll just read it and then we'll kind of unpack it. But a compulsory extraction of money, so again, it is being forced upon you, that you have to give money from that you have by a public authority, from, again, a government, a king, etc., for public purposes, right? And the goal is to do something on behalf, right, of a group, enforceable by law. And again, there are teeth behind this, that they can actually, right, garnish your wages, or, right, take your money out of your bank accounts, etc. And is not payment for services rendered, right? You're not paying for services here. Rather, there is an above and beyond, right, taxation, right? So sometimes there are fees associated with different government things. Like, for instance, let's say a passport costs a certain amount of money. Now, I don't know how much money it costs to really process all the paperwork and everybody who's behind the desks, all their salaries. But in theory, if the amount of money they bring home from the passport payments is really just to cover the costs of all those people, then that would be a service rendered. It wouldn't be called a tax, right? And if, let's say, someone gives you an option to pay something, so then that's not compulsory, that's optional, right? So a tax has to fit into this definition. Again, we'll see certain examples that are not perfectly fitting into this, but this is kind of the best short definition I came across for what is a definition of taxes. Now, in the world today that we live, so you have different types of taxes, and we'll see how some of these play out in Jewish law as well. So the first is what's called a regressive tax, or a head tax. People of lower income pay a higher percentage of the tax resource, right? So that sounds pretty silly, but basically what this means is if you have a tax where everyone pays the same number, the same amount, then if you have less money, that amount is a higher percentage of your money, right? So if everyone has to pay, right, let's say a toll to cross the George Washington Bridge, and you have to cross the George Washington Bridge, so that sum is going to be more expensive, right? When every time you cross the bridge, it's not like they say, well, how much money do you make? So we're going to take a certain percentage of your money. No, it's a flat fee. So if there is a tax that works in a similar way, then every time a person pays that tax, the person on the lower end of the spectrum is going to be impacted greater than the person higher up. Flat proportional means that everybody pays the same percentage of their tax resource, which means everyone pays 20%, everybody pays 15%, everyone pays 30%, whatever it is, but that you have a standard number and everybody pays the same number. A progressive tax is when, the assumption is that if you have more money, then having a higher percentage of your money taken for taxes is going to hurt you in terms of your standard of living less, even though technically you're paying more money because you have more money. Your standard of living is going to be hit less than someone who has less money and is being taken even a lesser percentage. So just to put my numbers to it, let's say you make $50,000 and you pay a 10% tax. So you're going to pay $5,000 on the $50,000. So you come out with $45,000. So you have to live within the means of that $45,000. Now, if somebody makes, right, $2 million and they have to pay a 50% tax instead of a 10% tax, which is 5 times the percentage, you still come away with $1 million versus 45,000. So a person who has 45,000 certainly is going to have a different universe of standard of living than someone who has $1 million to take home every single year. So that's kind of where a progressive approach to taxes comes in. Again, right, in politics, this often becomes, right, a big debate as to whether or not, right, do you cut taxes for the people who are the employers, because then they'll right, they'll employ more people and they'll create more jobs and blah blah blah, right? That's like the ongoing argument that you'll get from the right on this perspective, and then the left will say, but they have so much money, we should really tax them. It will make everybody else's lives much better. And then, right, the response is, well, they're just going to leave. They're not going to pay it. They'll find a loophole, blah, blah, blah. It's an interesting conversation that we have really every couple of years when different people take power, and how to try to deal with various issues with the American tax system. But these three, as we're gonna discuss, we're gonna try and see, right? We'll find examples, particularly of regressive, and then what we'll find is that over the course of time, there is a move to, right, have more of the tax burden fall on the wealthier. Though what I would argue is that it's really not so clear from our Makoros whether they're suggesting just a flat proportional situation where they're paying more because they have more, but it's the same percentage, or if it's actually more in not just number, but in percentage as well. So we'll have that conversation when we have it, and we'll see some of the svarot, some of the reasons that are given don't necessarily hold true to this day, but the fact that they were willing to move beyond the regressive type of tax is indication that if there was some sort of Jewish legal system that was creating these things, we would be comfortable with some of these more, I guess you'd call modern versions of taxation. Now, to start off, what I just want to do is highlight that from the Torah itself, from the Bible itself, we will find a whole host of different taxes, more or less, in different arenas. Does anyone want to throw out any possibilities before we go through them?
Are you asking where we find taxes in Tanakh?
Yeah, in the Torah itself.
Oh, well, I was going to say in Tanakh, we find right before the split between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. Wasn't that the alleged reason was that the people felt they were taxed too much?
Yeah, so that was after the death of Shlomo. That is true, that when Rechavam takes over, some of his people tell him that he should lessen the taxes, and then some of the youngins of Rechavam's aides told him, no, you should even add more to the taxes. And when he adds more to the taxes, it's part of the reason for the break. So I mean more in terms of halacha than in terms of narrative. But that's a great example from a narrative from Tanakh where we find taxes playing a role. But from purely a halachic vantage point, are there any examples of things that we have in our system that would be, right, what you would approximate to be a tax?
Meiser, Truma.
Very good, right? So Truma and Meiser, so those we'll see, right, in Bamidbar and Devarim. So in Devarim, you have the concept of Truma and also Matanos L'Kahuna, different gifts, or not gifts, but again, obligations that you have whenever you brought a korban for a kohen. And this is, right, the law for the Kohanim from the people, that whenever they would bring a korban, Im Shorim said, whether it was a bull or a sheep, they would give the Kohen the foreleg and the jawbone, the hakeva and the stomach. Additionally, the very first of your grain, wine, oil, and shearings all would go to the Kohen. So this is an example of a tax, so to speak, for the Kohen. Now, obviously, the more korbanot you brought, in theory, the more you'd be having to give, and the more But in terms of the reishis, it doesn't seem to matter how much you produce. It's just that you give him the beginnings, the first. So that is not. That's more of a head tax, more of a standard tax, right? If you have tons of sheep, then your first shearings are going to be a smaller percentage of your overall shearings. If you have a huge farm, then the first of your fruit and vegetables is going to be a smaller percentage of your fruit and vegetables. So again, here is an example of a regressive type of tax when it comes to the Kohanim. In Bimidbar, so we have the concept of Maaser. Because the Levites are on behalf of the Jewish people taking care of the needs of the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan, therefore we, the rest of the Jewish people, pay a portion for their service. So we give them maaser, we give them a tithe from our produce, because they take a portion of their time where they cannot produce food, where they're doing the spiritual work in the Mikdash and the Mishkan. So that's why they get that portion. Again, it's this is an example of what would seem like a flat proportional rate, You give them a portion of what your produce, so a tenth or whatever of your, or some amount of what you produce. So that is going to depend on how much you produce in terms of how much you give. The more you produce, the more you give. The less you produce, the less you give, and it's basically an equal percentage in each white. And additionally, you have a couple of other examples of taxes of sorts. So the first is the machatzis shekel, that for upkeep of the Mishkan, of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple or the tabernacle, there was a once a year tax of half a shekel from every single person. Whether you're the psukim actually spell it out, whether you're rich or poor, everybody gives a half a shekel. The idea of the half a shekel and why everyone gives the same is because, as it's actually ironic, it's a form of dignity that everyone gives the exact same number and everyone gives a half to show that we need everybody else, We're all part of a whole. None of us can be the Jewish people by ourselves. So again, even though it's a regressive tax, it's meant to be a tax that puts everybody on equal footing. Let's say it's Trumas Hashem because this is again the Mishkan and the Mizbeach, the Mishkan and the tabernacle. The Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, the tabernacle and the temple, were both meant to atone for our sins. Additionally, you have another what might be considered a tax in the context of a form of tzedakah, but it's a mandatory tzedakah, which is leket shechacha and peah, When you have people who have farmland, so when the farmer collects their produce, any stalks that fall while you're collecting them, that you're supposed to leave them. Anything that you pass by forgetting to gather in, you should leave it. And the corner of your field, you also should leave those things. Additionally, you have the parrot, which is the little grapes or the lone grapes from your vineyard, the underripe or the lone grapes that get left behind. Similarly, where you're supposed to leave those for the poor person. And these are that's what happens in the book of Ruth, in the book of Ruth, where Ruth goes to the field of Boaz and collects the leftovers, the leket shechapeah, from the fields of Boaz. Again, here it's a little bit hard, doesn't necessarily fit perfectly because it's not clear that this is a exact number, There's not an exact number of stalks that you're supposed to drop, or an exact amount of stalks in the corner that you're supposed to leave. right? This is a little bit of a tax that has a lot of flexibility built into it. So it doesn't really fit into any of the categories. It gives you a little bit more flexibility to do it as you see. Fine. The last that is less of a pure halacha, more of a minhag, is from Bereshis, or it comes actually from this week's parsha. And right, so when Yaakov Avinu starts making a little bit of money in the shepherding world, so after he removes the stone before he becomes the shepherd, right, kind of in this early stage of his fleeing from his father's home, but where he's in the process of first starting to go make a buck, he says to Hashem, right, everything that I make, I will give a tenth to you, right? I will surely give a tenth. Aser asrenu lach. And from there, many learn the concept of ma'aser in general, that we give a tenth of our earnings to tzedakah. But as I've noted in the past, there's nowhere in the books, right, of Tanakh where that's on the books as a halacha. It's a minhag. It's a strong minhag. It's a minhag that we strongly encourage. And tzedakah is a mitzvah, obviously, but the exact number that you're required to give of a tenth of your things is what I would call a very, very old and important minhag, not necessarily something that's formally on the books. So, but that again is in theory, if it's right, the obligation or the compulsion to give the tenth of your earnings towards tzedakah is more based in minhag than it is based in pure halacha. Okay, so this is kind of I would say the basis or the range of examples that you have in the Bible itself, in the Torah itself, and you have examples of what you might call the flat proportional rate, things like Meiser or Truma, and then you have things that are more regressive, things like Machatzis HaShekel, or the obligation to give Kohanim the first of your fruit and vegetables, and or the leg and the jaw and the stomach of your korbanot. So you have a little bit of both. The first two forms of taxes, so to speak, built into our system from the very get-go. What I want to show now, though, is that when you start to get into the Talmudic material, you start to see a little bit more as to what might be working behind, like how does it all work, what's going on, a little bit of how we understand the taxes as a concept, and then we'll see some achronim that deal in different situations and scenarios and how they come to their conclusions. So the first Gemara we're going to see is Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Hey Amid Aleph. So the third of the three Babas and the fifth page. It's actually a Mishnah. I think it's the fourth Mishnah in the first parak, if I remember correctly. But the Mishnah says, Kotel Chatzer Shenafal. So if you have a wall in a courtyard between two properties that falls, Mechayvin Oso Livnoso Ad Arba Amos, you can require your neighbor to rebuild that wall with you up to 4 amos tall. And if, let's say, right, the wall is built and then someone claims the other guy didn't pay, so we assume he did pay until you can bring proof that he didn't pay, because the assumption is that you guys did it together, because that's how these things would normally happen if a fence fell down. But let's say a person says, you know what, 4 amos is not enough. I don't want to see you at all. I would like the fence to go 10 amos high, because I don't want to know that you even exist. So midalat amos u'malon ein mechayvin. So you can't force your partner, your neighbor, to go in and pay for the difference in the fence cost between 4 amos and 10 amos, or however high you want your wall to be. Samuchlo kotel acher. But if, let's say, right, your neighbor builds the 10 amos and then you build another wall that also kind of fits the same 10 amos, and you're planning on putting a roof over between the two, even if you haven't put the roof yet, it shows that you liked their idea, you liked what they did, and then your neighbor can extract the difference of the additional from 4 to 10 or whatever the difference in the height that he had to pay. If you demonstrate that you actually liked what he did and you start kind of building off of it, then you'll be required to chip in your half. And the reverse is the assumption here, that b'cheska shalonas, and the assumption is that you didn't pay up until you bring a proof that you did. So make sure to maintain that proof that you actually in fact did pay up. Okay, so this is an example here of not necessarily a government forcing you to do this, although again they can enforce this law, right? But the idea is that you have a neighbor who is basically forcing your hand to help build something that is beneficial for both of you, right? And this is at its core, right, how taxes are supposed to work, right? That there is some sort of communal need, and if every single Tom, Dick, and Harry was going to do it by themselves, it would be very inefficient. But if everybody pools their resources and to do it once properly, then all of a sudden you have been able to create a community or fill a community need by everybody chipping in their part. And we see this a little bit in the language of the Raman, Choshen Mishpat, Hilchos Shutvim, the laws of partners. Ubnei ha'ir, b'inyanei tzarchei ha'ir, heim kishutvin, that the people of a city, in regarding the various needs of the city, are considered like partners. Im echad mehem tava la'acher kulan yodin ba'oso tvia ve'enan yachol nachzor liton. Right, and if you ask other people to chip in, right, everyone's aware that you're chipping in on behalf of the community, and you can't later back out of the request. So here again, right, the concept of paying a municipal tax or some sort of local tax in order to achieve some sort of communal need is very much kind of how this works. And again, on a national level, you could argue that defense, spending, which is a very huge part of the American budget, a lot of that would come out of tax dollars, because it makes a lot of sense for the federal government to be in charge of defending all of America versus each state trying to defend itself, which would be very inefficient when trying to defend itself from foreign adversaries. So this is kind of an example of kind of the thinking in halacha, is that we're all partners together, and we're trying to do something that would be much more efficient if we do it all together. And so everyone kind of is obligated as a partner to chip in for these public works. The Gemara a little bit later in Baba Basra, Dav Zayin Amid Beis. So here we're talking about so here, so Kofin also livnos. So again, we're forcing him to build something for the city. Right, so we're talking about building doors and walls for a city. So Rosh Gamliel Omer, lo kol ayaros ruyos l'choma. Not every single city needs a wall. Ela ir hasmucha l'sefer, only if it's near a border, right, near where it might be attacked from another nation, is it going to require some extra security. Ruy l'choma. V'she'ein hasmucha l'sefer, but if it's not near the border, then maybe it doesn't need it. Rabbanan zimnin de mikru v'asis gayasa. But the rabbi said, but you can't. You're if you don't have a wall, then the army will bypass the walled city and they'll ransack your city. So who's to say that even if you're not right next to the border, that you shouldn't have a wall around your city? So this is where the translation starts to kick in, right, that I have here. So they asked Rabbi Elazar, rather asked Rabbi Yochanan, Kishehin Govin, when they would take money for the walls of the city, Lefi Nafshos Govin, Odilma Lefi Shevach Mamon Govin. So how did they calculate how much each person would give to this project? Did they calculate based off of just your body, right? How many people in your household, right? So you have to pay X amount, or was it based off of how much of your possessions are being protected, right? Meaning, if let's say you have a $10 million home, so you are more invested in the security of that $10 million home than someone who's in a little $500,000 or for $50,000 home, right? A smaller home, right? So maybe you should, if you have more to protect, you should be paying more. In other words, if you have more money, right? Again, in your asset at least, then perhaps you should be required to chip in more because in theory you're gaining more. So Amarle Mamon Govin. It's based off of the money that is protected. So this is right. It would be an example of it's really about the benefit, so to speak, that comes out of this protection, and perhaps the benefit is greater for people who have more assets. So in this case, it could be that the tax for paying for this public works should be directly proportional to that protection. Rav Elazar beni kava ba masmaros. So he said, so Rav Yochanan said to Rav Elazar, my son, you should establish this on the boards, right? So you should post this, right? This should become, right before they had Facebook and Twitter, but they would put this on the community board that this is what they should base their calculus based off of. Now the Gemara does an Ika de Amri, which is always fascinating. Whenever the Gemara does Ika de Amri, it's another version of this conversation, but this version of the conversation changes everything. So in the Ika de Amri, the Gemara says, when they asked for money from the people in the city, is it based off of how nice the assets that are being protected are? Or is it about how close the houses are to the wall? Right? Meaning how close are the houses to this wall that you're benefiting more because your house is closer to the border. So if people were going to loot or people were going to kind of come into the city and cause some damage, it's likely that your home would be the home that gets targeted. So therefore you benefit more, not because you have a bigger asset, but because your home would be the more likely target. Less, meaning again, if there was a battle, if there was a battalion coming in, then the whole city is getting ransacked. But if you had only a couple of good for nothings coming into the city to cause a little bit of trouble, so it's more likely that they're not going to go all the way into the city to cause the trouble, because then it's going to be harder for them to get out without getting caught. But if they just stay on the edge, then they can accomplish what they need and then bounce. But if there was a wall, it would be significantly harder for them to do that. So the people who are on the border, especially back in those days, would benefit significantly more. So there it's less about the money or the asset that's being protected, and it's more about how much do you gain from said public works project. The more you gain, the more you should put in. There's actually another Gemara that I didn't bring that talks about more about this topic, and actually says that Talmidei Chachamim are exempt from paying for walls because their Torah will protect them. Which is again, depending on how I clearly don't have enough faith in my Torah learning, but it's again, there's an idea out there that our Torah protects us. It's interesting that many on that Gemara highlight that that's only true about paying or funding the wall, because in theory the Talmud Chacham doesn't benefit from that. But when it comes to defending your country, right, that is not a good source for an exemption, because everybody has to put their life, so to speak, on the line on behalf of the kahal. So you can't use that same excuse to get out of fighting in a war. But I thought it was a funny little Gemara there about exempting Torah scholars from this obligation. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch talks about another case, which again, I think would be a very comical conversation in many communities today, regarding bringing in chazanim for the high holy days. So the Shulchan Aruch says, "Schar shliach tzibor poren mikupas hakahal." So in terms of paying for a chazan, you can do so from the communal funds. And even though the Shliach Tzibor is going to be praying on behalf of the poor like the rich, the abilities of the poor are not the same as the abilities of the rich. And this is one of the earlier sources in halachic texts that really start to push the concept of differentiated taxes. That again, it's not clear from this Shulchan Aruch whether this is just a flat proportional situation or if it's in fact a progressive tax situation. But either way, it's clear that the Shulchan Aruch is comfortable, at least in things like the need for Shliach Tzibor on the high holy days, that these types of things should be paid for by the wealthy significantly more than the less wealthy, than the poor, right? So that's the Shulchan Aruch's perspective. The Rama has a little bit of a bridge perspective. The Rama says as follows: V'yesh omrim shegovim chatzi lefi mamon, v'chatzi lefi anafashos. Right? So you do a half and half. So half of the money is going to be based off of head count, right? So there's a partial regressive tax, but obviously the poor can't cover, right, as much as the wealthy. So when you get to the second half of it, right, so there'll be a base that everybody pays, and then above that base, that's when you'll use either a flat proportional or a progressive rate to fill in the rest. And that's what the Rama says is the practice in many congregations. Now it's interesting, right? Like, meaning we have, right, this conversation doesn't really address things like exemptions or other things which you have tons of in the American tax code, right? That there are people who don't make a certain amount of money, so everybody, right, up to a certain amount of the money that you take home is pre-tax, right? If you make a certain minimum, and the amount of other things that we've added in of benefits for people who can't afford it, again, are all wonderful things that the American system does for the safety net for the least fortunate. So those are things that maybe we'll have to discuss in the future. But this is kind of the first shift into, right, the possibility of a more progressive tax thought process. What I want to just do now is bring up these two tshuvas that I came across. One from the Sheres Yisrael, which is Rabbi Jacob Katz, who was a rabbi in the, I think of what today would be like Belarus type of space area, but he talks about his 16th century, I believe here, 16th century. So it says Poland, but I think it would really be Belarus of today. But the case was very interesting. Sheila al kila kedosha sheba alehem shilvu shagoyim loratzu lanicham sheyishchatu. So there was basically a rule that the non-Jews didn't want to let the Jewish community shecht animals, v'yimkeru habasar, and sell the meat. V'ayu tzrichim hotza l'snicho litain b'neihem gimel gedolim mikol behema shana achas v'osan hamos yiyu muchanim lishtadel bohem. They basically wanted to create some sort of tax that they would have to pay every single time they shechted an animal. And they came to a conclusion, they came to an agreement. It would pay 40 gold coins every single year to give them the right to shecht animals during the whole year, right? And so the rich wanted that every single time you shechted an animal, you'd have to pay a certain percentage of the animals. That would eventually, can you do the math? How much do animals we shecht over the course of the year? And then, right, we'll figure it out. And every single time you shecht an animal, you have to pay that portion. Right, and kol shana v'shana tiyeh ha'atala kefi ha'otzan. So basically, that little extra that the community itself would self-impose would cover this 40 gold piece tax. V'haniyim, but the poorer people, Lomar Osad Sheshochtin Harbe, right, who apparently, so I'm not sure exactly why the poor people were the ones who were doing more shlita. The only thing I could come up with was that perhaps they had larger families, so they were poorer, but they had to put more food on the table, so they had to, right, they were engaged in the shechting of animals more. So they asked, they wanted to figure out based off of who has the most money, and then there should be a proportional tax for everybody based off of how much money you had to cover this 40 gold tax from the government. and not based off of each and every animal. Anyways, long story short, right? So he starts off the tshuva and he ends the tshuva the same way. Tshuva nir li shadin im ha'aniyim, right? I think that the din follows the poor, and right at the end he reaffirms that din Torah ki kol davar mamon chashuven, b'chashven lefi mamon, right? That all these things that have to do with money, we should establish them based off of the amount of money that you have. That it should be based on how much money you make, like other taxes. The chol shekain b'nidon, certainly in this case, because this is just a temporary situation. This is not based on any permanent custom. This is what I see. I wrote. So basically, he comes to the conclusion that he thinks this is a communal need. We need a shviot shecht meat over the course of the year, and the wealthy should pay more because you have more money to basically pay it. And so this is, again, it seems to me to be more of a flat proportional. That's what it sounds like. But in theory, if you wanted to try to kvetch in the progressive tax rate into this conversation, in theory, I think you could maybe argue for that. Not sure. The second case is from the Maharam Padua. So this is from Meir Katzenellenbogen, who was another important rabbi in a similar time frame, and so 16th century Italy. So he was talking about the need to build a shul. Let's see if I can find the line. Right, regarding the idea of building a shul, there was a general rule from the Maharam that in any situation where you can't just have everybody pay the same amount because it just wouldn't work for one reason or another, as porin vegovin lefi mamon, you can then shift the tax to be, or the communal need, that it should be based off of how much money different people have. Pasak al shchiros hachazon biyamim anoraim shemachashvin lefi mamon nasan tam ledvarav shetolin b'mamon kimach mas oshram lo yuchlu etzeis bebetehem. Right, so he says, and this is what I mean by some of the svaras don't apply anymore. He says the reason is because that they're so wealthy, it's unlikely for them to leave because they didn't want to leave their assets behind. Nowadays, it's the opposite, right? Nowadays, if you have a lot of money, the likelihood of you being there for the to hear the chazan or to be in the shul are less likely because you can travel, and leisure travel is a huge thing that people who are wealthy do. So, the svara doesn't work anymore. But nevertheless, I don't think that it undermines, the concept of taxing based off of ability versus off of every person paying the exact amount. And so you have these tshuvot, which again are reflective of the reality of the Middle Ages. It really goes back the concept of there being a centralized Jewish communal leadership that was responsible for certain communal needs of the Jewish community and would often interface with the non-Jewish world. Goes back already to the times of the Gaonim and earlier, where there were people like the Exilarch and whatnot who literally paid the tax to the non-Jewish tax collectors on behalf of the Jewish community. And then later you had Jewish communities that were fully autonomous by themselves that would tax the community as necessary. Anyways, the long story of this this conversation is that what we see is that even though from the biblical examples, we certainly have more examples of regressive tax, of where there's just a lump sum that was imposed upon everybody, that the poskim over the course of generations became more and more comfortable and fond of, in situations where that lump sum tax would not be feasible, to in fact have a either a flat proportional or a progressive tax where the taxes change depending on income. Now, part of that also makes sense because, again, the Machantis HaShekel was not a large sum of money. Now, if you're broke, any sum of money is still a sum of money. But the point is that the goal with the Machatz shekel was not to break anyone's bank account. It was a small amount of money that everybody gave. Most of the other taxes that we spoke about meant that you had land or you had fruit or vegetables or things that you were growing that you had to then give a portion of that to the Kohanim. If you didn't have what to give, then you were exempt from all of those various taxes. So it makes sense, right, to see the concept and the ability to, right, create a system within the realm of the halachic world that uses some of these other forms of taxes that are not regressive, but rather flat, proportional, or progressive. And again, how it would work, what would work, how all these things I don't really know, but it's interesting to think about and to find examples of these things in Torah, Gemara, and the Achronim as well. I'll stop here for any thoughts or questions. Okay, so we'll leave it here. Look, I'm no economist. I don't really know how to structure an economy in the best ideal way. You certainly have a lot of very smart people who don't seem to agree about almost anything. So it's fun to read up on these various things and how to make sense of it. And obviously, even the Jewish system, I'm sure, would require lots of tweaking at different points to create the proper incentive structures and whatnot to make sure that everything was working. But all things on balance, part of the safety net system of the Jewish people is one of charity or tzedakah, really. And it's interesting, actually, even to think about the difference between the word charity and tzedakah, right? That from a Jewish perspective, tzedakah comes from the language of tzedek, right? That this is what's required and right, as opposed to in Christianity, it's a lot more of like out of the goodness of your heart. And it's interesting that where tzedakah is, again, there is a certain magnanimity, the flexibility built into the system to take care of the people who don't have out of free will. And at the same time, there are certain communal compunctions to make sure things like a kupa tzedakah and other things, that these things exist. So it's a little bit of we want to make sure that everybody is taken care of. We want to make sure that people are not taking advantage of the system. We want to make sure that we are being as kind and responsible as we possibly can. And so hopefully we can take these ideas and apply them in our own lives, even if we're not in control of any of these systems currently.
Shakar, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Good night, everybody.
Good night.